Hey there, this is Christy Winfrey with Legacy Transactions bringing you another Tuesday tip. This week we are going to talk about filling out the HOA Addendum. This is an offer document, so when you're representing a buyer, you need to make sure that you supply this HOA Addendum when you send that offer to the listing agent. And when you get that executed contract back, you need to make sure that you have this as one of the executed docs. It is a negotiable item, or the HOA Addendum is a negotiable item, so you need to make sure that it is fully negotiated with the offer in the contract. So when you're making an offer, what I would suggest is go ahead and call the HOA and ask a few questions. One, ask what the annual or monthly HOA dues are. That might depend on the type of property. If it's a condo or townhome, they're most likely going to be monthly. If it's a single family, most likely it's going to be annual HOA. Ask how much the transfer fee is. Also ask how much they charge to get the HOA statement of accounts. And then finally ask if there is a foundation fee or a cap fee or any other fees associated with purchasing that home. What I found is some of these newer HOAs are charging these fees that are like a percentage of the sales price each time that home is sold. And so you'll need to know, are they charging that, and who's responsible for paying for it? Because what you'll want to do is when you write that offer, that might be something that you ask the sellers to pay for or ask to split the cost. And of course, it also depending on the market that we're in, and are you going to win that offer if you write it in for the seller to pay that fee? You may not do that, but at least you'll know that that is a fee that has to be paid at closing, and your buyers are not going to be surprised by any large fees, because sometimes it could be $1,000, $2,000, depending on the price of the home. It could get very expensive. So let's look at that HOA addendum. So you're going to start by filling it out, fill out the address, fill out the HOA information and the phone number. And then paragraph A is really important, because in paragraph 1, or box 1, you're going to check if you want the sellers to pay for and deliver the HOA bylaws, restrictions, and resale certificate. I usually put 21 days here, depending on how long you have for closing, because it does take the HOAs some time to get those delivered. A lot of times it's like 10 business days from the time the HOA payment is made to get that delivered. And so you want to have more time here. This does say that if seller delivers the subdivision information, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after buyer receives subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If buyer does not receive the subdivision information, buyer at buyer's sole remedy may terminate the contract at any time prior to closing, and earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So if those seller's disclosures are not delivered on time, then the buyer could technically terminate the contract all the way to closing. So if you represent the seller and box number 1 is checked, it's really important to make sure that those documents are delivered on time. Now, box number 2 is pretty much saying the same thing, but instead of it being the seller that's paying for it, it's going to be the buyer that pays for it and gets them. So, so this is really important to know the difference between the two. And the reason box number 1 or 2 is important is because those HOA documents are going to tell that buyer what they can do with the property. So if, let's say, they wanted to ever rent the property out, there might be restrictions on if that HOA allows rentals in the neighborhood, or if they allow so many rentals in the neighborhood. If they wanted to paint their door black for some reason, that might be restricted according to the HOA. So those bylaws and restrictions are going to let that buyer know what they can do with the house, and it gives information, all that important information that could give the buyer a way to terminate the contract if for some reason they're not able to do with the property what they're wanting. So that's why number 1 or 2 would be important to be checked. Number 3 would be that the buyer has received and approved the subdivision information before signing the contract, and then the buyer does or does not require an updated resale certificate. I don't see this one checked very often, but every now and then I have. And so it says if buyer requires an updated resale cert, seller at seller's seller at buyer's expense shall deliver it to buyer within 10 days after receiving payment for the updated resale cert. Buyer may terminate this contract and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer if seller fails to deliver updated resale cert within the time required. So again, that's another way out of the contract should that not get delivered on time. And then box number 4, I do see this checked probably the most, but again, it doesn't give your buyer any kind of protection as a way out of the contract should they not be able to do something with the home that they're wanting to do. So box number 4 just says buyer does not require delivery of subdivision information. So for more protection for the buyer, it's probably recommended to check box number 1 or 2, depending on who's going to pay for it. Now, I do want to make sure that you're aware that it's an upfront cost for the subdivision information, and sometimes it can be pretty expensive. So whoever's going to pay for them, just make sure they understand that the title company most likely is going to probably send them a link saying, you need to go ahead and pay for this, and it is an upfront cost to them. C talks about any transfer fees. So it says, except provided by paragraphs A and D, buyer shall pay any and all association fees, deposits, reserves, and other charges associated with the transfer of the property not to exceed, and that would be the dollar amount that it would not exceed. And then the seller shall pay any excess. The paragraph D is talking about the HOA statement of account. So it's saying that if the seller authorizes the association to release and provide the subdivision information and any updated resale certificate if requested by the buyer, the title company, or any broker in the sale. If buyer does not require the subdivision information or updated resale cert and the title company requires information from the association, such as status of dues, special assessments, violations, and covenants and restrictions, and a waiver of the right of first refusal, buyer or seller shall pay the title company the cost of obtaining this information. So I've always seen title companies that need a statement of accounts when there's an HOA, and that discloses how much the HOA dues are, if there are any violations, if there's any dues that are past due, all the details about money. And they need that so they can put that on the settlement statement. This is going to say who is going to pay for it, and this is an upfront cost to them. So it's really important to make sure that your client is aware that whatever is checked here, if it's them, they're the buyer, they're going to get probably a link from the HOA saying this needs to be paid for. And they need to take care of it as soon as possible when they get that. So that way there's not a rush fee that has to be added to it. Because again, it can be pricey enough from the HOAs to get these documents. And then if they have to add a rush fee, then it gets even more expensive. I don't recommend putting both people here as, that they're going to split the cost, because one of them has to pay the cost up front and then the other person would have to be reimbursed at closing. So if you're going to do that, just make sure you write in special provisions on the actual contract, who's going to pay for it up front and then who's getting reimbursed half at closing. And then let's see, same thing here on the transfer fee. You could technically do half and half, but I usually see just an actual dollar amount there. And the upfront cost here, again, it's just really important to know and let your clients know that the HOA is an upfront cost, and so to be expecting that. Anyway, we hope you have a fantastic week. And should you have any questions about that HOA addendum, feel free to reach out. I know it's a lot of information and it can be a little tricky, but the really biggest thing is make sure you have that executed with the executed contract. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.